Hello and welcome to Unacademy. As part of a Hindu analysis today, we'll be discussing 6 to 7 important articles out of the Hindu newspaper. But before we begin, two very important announcements. As always, the 24,999 price is back with a 9 months extension if you take this course. And if you have any doubts related to the program, what are the different components of it, or you need any form of counseling, there's a form given in the description box. You can fill that up and we will call you and we will help you in the whole process. Further, there is a Telegram link for my channel. You will find the PDF for this CNA session in the Telegram channel linked in the description box. With this, let's look at the 6 topics we are going to cover. First is universal basic income. This is a very interesting static concept which is there within economics, but there is a very interesting take on this by an economist. And they have given a very interesting model about it. I'll tell you what are the basic components of this article. Then this is related to what is called Google tax and the monopolistic behavior of Google. Then we'll talk about this article, though then doesn't give us a lot of solutions. It's basically based on what is the human development indicators in India, how have we progressed into it. Further, the doctor strike is in the news quite a lot. However, this talks about the healthcare sector. Then we'll talk about the spike in tomato prices, and last but not the least, in the, you can say, the spectrum of leaders which Israel wanted to kill, Sinwar is dead, believed to be the mastermind of October 7th. So with this, let's move into first the question which I gave you yesterday and then the topic. So I gave you this question yesterday. A lot of you have answered it in the chat box also. Most of you are correct. 99.9% of you are correct, which is, I had asked you which of the following are parameters of the global hunger index. And yes, only stunting and wasting is, these two are not indicators. So the answer was only 2. So yes, I'll keep on giving you these types of practice questions and I encourage you to give the answers in the comment box. With this, let's look at this topic, which is a modified UBI policy may be more feasible. Now, there are 3 to 4 things which we first need to understand. What do you understand by UBI, which is universal basic income? Then this article itself is in 3 components. The first one is what is UBI, what is the need for it. Then the concept of desirability and fiscal viability. And the last is the most interesting, where it talks about how a modified UBI can work in India vis-a-vis the schemes which we already have. So as soon as you say universal basic income, the thing which comes to your mind is everybody is going to get money, irrespective of anything. And that is basically the basic definition of UBI only. So what I'll do is I'll start to build this topic in such a way that first we'll discuss what is UBI. Then can we say DBT, which is direct benefit transfer, is UBI or not. Then we'll talk about this aspect of what is this desirability and viability or feasibility concept. And then we will go into the you can say the solution part, the possible scheme. But this one is a little bit of a big utopia. I'll tell you how it actually stacks up in the larger scheme of things. Now, first things first, UBI, universal basic income. Now, universal basic income has 2 perspectives. Some people think that it is a facilitator, and some economists argue that it is a social security scheme or social security safety net. Now, there are 4 very important, you can say, characteristics which make a cash transfer into universal basic income. You can break the word itself, universal basic income, and it is related to workers' dignity, it is related to basic life and below poverty line, people coming out of that with the help of universal basic income. But the 4 characteristics which actually are considered pivotal for any cash transfer to be called universal basic income is, first, it has to be unconditional, meaning it has to be totally irrelevant, the unconditional transfer, and has nothing to do with the working status of that person. Meaning if I am working, you are not working, employed, unemployed, below poverty, fragmented land, farmer, landless peasant, tenant, anything, you have to give this money irrespective of the employment status. Unconditionally, it has to be transferred. You can be the CEO of the company. You can also be a person who's working for the company as an employee. Further, you can be a contractor. Everybody gets universal basic income because employment status is irrelevant. Then it has to be universal, which is again independent of income status. So if I'm employed or not employed should be irrelevant. Do I have an income is irrelevant. Further, it can only be transferred to an individual within a household, not a household itself or the head of the household. Meaning it can't be that I give it to the head of the household and expect everybody to get it. And it has to be periodic, meaning it can't be one-time transfer. It can be either hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, annually, but has to be periodic. The frequency has to be decided. If none of these four is met or any one is met, still it will not be called universal basic income. Only when all four are met, it becomes universal basic income. Unconditional, not related to your employment, universal, irrespective of income, individual and periodic. Now, if you look at this, it seems to be a very grand scheme. So, what is the point of giving a universal basic income to, for example, a CEO of the company? The point is he will get the amount he would have to pay taxes. It will all actually become more or less equal. Because for a person who has an income, he would have to declare that income and therefore thereafter he would then have to give taxes on it, and it would then basically become a flat line rather than being an advantage to the persons. So the aspect of universality is something which a lot of critics say that is not possible. But the argument is if a taxpayer is given some income, he has to pay taxes and therefore he is contributing something out of the universal basic income back to the economy itself. So, are there schemes across the world which try to use this concept of universal basic income? And the answer is yes. In the US, the Alaska Permanent Fund distributes states' oil revenue per capita basis to all the residents. In California, again, we have a scheme in which a person receives $500 a month for about 18 months. Thereafter, in Finland, there's a scheme since 2017 to pay 2,000 jobless people assistance with 560 euros a month. However, this was stopped last year, and this is not technically universal basic income because it is only been given to the jobless, which is unemployed. So the universality of the or the unconditionality of the concept goes away. Then you have Kenya, which has the largest experiment where everybody in a village receives $0.5 a day to $1 a day. Brazil again has an experiment. France is running an experiment. UK and Germany are conducting research. In Ontario, there is a basic income scheme which is being tested again. In Britain, you have Barcelona. In British Columbia, you have again plans to experiment, and Switzerland had also floated an idea of universal basic income but was defeated by the people itself. So if you look at it, these are actually not fitting into the concept of UBI but are modified UBI schemes, which is that either the unconditionality or the universality or the individual nature or the periodic nature are in a way exceptions, but they are trying something. In India, as soon as you say UBI, looking at the population, there's a lot of hue and cry which starts within academic circles that it is not possible. And the politicians would argue that there's already UBI. So now that we understand what is UBI, let's try to differentiate. First things first, I'll repeat, UBI is income transferred to an individual on a periodic basis, unconditionally and universally. Universal, not based on income criteria, unconditionally not based on employment criteria. Now, in India, there's a very big issue. And the reason why we are having this discussion is that we are going through a phase of what is called as automation. We are going through a phase where AI and machine learning are becoming more and more important. And therefore, with this, employment for youth is going to become a very big issue, because the more the automation and mechanization, the increase in labor productivity will therefore bring down the labor demand. And when there is labor demand is lower, employment for the youth is going to become a problem. And India for the past 2 decades has been obviously going through what is called as jobless growth. We have been growing as an economy, but we have been wasting a demographic dividend in a way wherein the people do not have employment opportunities. Jobs are not created, but growth in GDP has been there. This is where jobless growth is actually related to the process of automation, use of technology, AI, machine learning, where there were 5 to 6 people needed to do one job. Now there's only one person. So therefore labor productivity has gone up, but labor demand has come down. And this is where there's a lot of chatter again within the academic circles and within the government Niti Aayog that should we consider UBI. And at one given point of time, the finance ministry and even the government had considered UBI because the economic survey talked about the potentiality of UBI in India. But thereafter, it went under the carpet and there has been no conversation about UBI. But again, it has come to fore with the Samsung, you can say, strikes happening, with labor dignity being talked about, employment and the employment data not being very, very encouraging. And therefore, jobless growth issue is something which has to be catered to. And therefore, UBI is being seen as a solution. Now, we know now what is UBI. We also understand what is the context of having this discussion. Now the question is, can I say that what we do in DBT, which is direct benefit transfer, using Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, can I say that a cash transfer to a farmer under DBT is UBI? Because a lot of people argue that it is UBI. And the answer to that question is, be it any scheme in India, all these schemes are targeted. And if they are targeted, they cannot be UBI because UBI has to be universal, has to be unconditional, and has to be periodic, and has to be over and above that individual based. Now, while most of these schemes, for example, let's take PM Kisan itself, which is Kisan Samman Nidhi Yojana, it is periodic, it is individual, but it is not unconditional and universal. Initially, it had a small or fragmented land holding concept. Then it became universal, but only universal amongst farmers, and it is only given to farmers. And therefore, all DBT schemes in India, therefore, are targeted either to the youth, or to women, or to elderly, or to farmers, or to the vulnerable section of the society. You and me will not get it because we may not fall under this category. So, by definition, direct benefit transfer is not UBI. So, we can't argue that UBI exists in India. So, UBI, that is why I gave you the definition, unconditional, universal, periodic, individual. Therefore, DBT will not be eligible for it. Now, DBT is good if you understand your population quite well. And more than that, there's a cost of DBT, which is called the concept of administrative cost of exclusion, inclusion and transfer, because there are multiple exclusionary policies and there are multiple conditions under which DBT is given, be it any scheme. Therefore, you need a mechanism to, in a way, you can say, filter out who is eligible, who is not eligible. So, therefore, DBT is not free of cost. It's not just that the government is going to send the money to the farmer. There is a cost to that. And this is where we have to understand that does UBI in a way solve that issue. Now, before I go into that, there's a very interesting line which is written in this article. It says that when it comes to schemes, there are two types or two considerations which are there. One is called desirability, that do we desire it, which is what is the desirability of it. And the second one is feasibility of it, which is something which I desire, is it feasible or not. And it gives a very interesting example that it may be desirable that I transfer 10,000 rupees to every Indian. But is it fiscally feasible? No, obviously, because it is not something which would make any fiscal sense that 10,000 rupees to transfer to everybody. So, there is a desirability, there is a feasibility. And therefore, mostly UBI is seen to be desirable but not feasible, and DBT is not desirable but feasible to be done. And therefore, desirability and feasibility is something which dictates most of the schemes. That is where the government has to find a balance between desirability and feasibility. So, UBI has to be universal, unconditional, periodic and individual, but that is desirable. It cannot be feasible to actually go with such a principle, and there has to be a middle path. That is what the author is trying to give us. Now, DBT is targeted, so by definition it is not UBI. However, what would be the advantages? And this is where the article became very interesting. What are the advantages of UBI? Meaning, if I push in UBI in its true sense, what are the advantages? This is something which will help you in the examination to write the answers and gives you fodder for the mains answer. The first aspect which is talked about is that it stops inclusion and exclusion errors. Now, this is a very interesting concept, which is that, see, no scheme is perfect, and at the grassroots level, there will always be error. Somebody had to be included, but he did not get included, or she did not get included. Somebody had to be excluded, but he or she is part of the scheme. So there will always be inclusion and exclusion errors if there is a DBT based understanding, and therefore as soon as you go for universal scheme, you stop the inclusion and exclusion error. Second, because it is universal, there is no need for intermediary. As it is right now, through PAN or through Aadhaar, the government has our mobile numbers. The government more or less has all the information on us. So if they want to transfer the money and there is no inclusion, exclusion, there is no concept of scanning or filtering, it can be transferred easily. So therefore there is no need for intermediary only. So you remove one step, and therefore this is where you can save cost. Cost is lowered and it saves costs, administrative cost, which is that there is now no need for multiple levels of screening, and therefore this is where we minimize errors but also reduce administrative cost. And last but not the least is, with this we create a scheme, or we can create schemes which are easier to implement, because then I don't need to create the machinery in each and every state or a portal which has to be maintained. In a way, everybody has to get it unconditionally, periodically as an individual, and therefore the costs of the scheme and the administrative cost of the scheme, further the need for intermediaries will go away. Now these seem to be very idealistic understanding that yes, very good, perfect. This is where the concept comes to, that these advantages are desirable, but these advantages are not feasible, because as soon as we talk about UBI, we go into a number which is quite high. Now, before I go into the third aspect, as I said, there are three aspects to this whole article. We have discussed the first two. I'll try to first weave the story around the first two, which is that we have defined that UBI is universal, unconditional, periodic transfer of money to an individual. It has to be universal, unconditional, then it only is UBI. Are countries experimenting with it? Yes, they are doing that. Income transfer. Can I say that an income transfer scheme under DBT is UBI? The answer is no. The reason is because they are targeted. For example, Manrega, for example, midday meals, be it PM Kisan, be it any other scheme which is running right now, either it is women-centric, elderly-centric, youth-centric, child-centric, it has a targeted, therefore it has filtering, it is not universal. So, can we move to UBI? What would be the in principle, you can say, advantages of moving to UBI? The in principle advantages of moving to UBI would be that we will not need intermediaries, it will be more cost effective, and it will therefore be desirable to have a scheme where inclusion errors will automatically be negated, because everybody is part of that scheme itself. Till this point, everything seems to be very perfect. Why not then just apply UBI? Because if UBI is so desirable, if UBI has such advantages, then why not remove all the schemes in India, have income transfer, and therefore we have the mechanism to do that. This is where the feasibility aspect comes through. Because as soon as we talk about UBI in India and we talk about a substantial amount, for example, if I go for even 1,000 rupees, or the Tendulkar committee said that 1,500 rupees should be the minimum amount per month to be transferred to a household to keep it above the poverty line. If I do that, then the cost of that comes to 3.5% to 11% of the GDP. And this is quite high, because there will be either two solutions to this: increase the taxes, or you subsume all the schemes and only have one scheme, which is a UBI, which again makes no sense, because India, with its unity in diversity and its vulnerabilities, needs targeted schemes also. Now, till this point, the article actually is based on real models. Now, I'm telling you this because after this point, he will go into his own model, which is called modified UBI. Before I do that, I'm telling you, as of right now, as much as we have the desirability to have UBI, the feasibility of UBI is problematic, because 3.5% to 11% of GDP without increasing taxes or without removing all the schemes, there is no way we can meet it. And this is a very high cost of UBI, and therefore, because it is universal, it will go to taxpayers, and therefore the government does gain taxes, but it becomes a vicious circle. The more the UBI increases, the more income increases, the more taxation, and therefore it really negates the purpose of UBI in that regard. Therefore, how can we apply UBI if UBI has to be applied? So, 4 aspects we have already covered. What is UBI? Is DBT or income transfer UBI? No. What is desirability and feasibility of a scheme? And have countries tried to experiment with it? Now, what is the solution which the author is giving us? What is the solution which he is giving? He comes up with a very interesting scheme. He says, and it's an oxymoron in itself, he says we can experiment with what is called as limited universal income transfer. Now, why do I say it's an oxymoron? Because limited and universal are contradictory words. But basically, if I reverse these, it will not become an oxymoron. It becomes universal limited income transfer. This is where the limited is not on the people but on the income. And he says that if you want a solution, the author along with economist Karthikeya Muralidharan both have come up with a cost of 1% of GDP per capita, and the argument being pushed is, if we take PM Kisan, which is Kisan Samman Nidhi Yojana, if you take PM Kisan concept was initially to only small and fragmentary holdings, now to all farmers. It transfers rupees 6,000 per year. Now, the argument is, if 6,000 per year is considered by the government as good enough to keep a farmer out of poverty, and it's a good income concept, therefore, let us use the PM Kisan model. If the PM Kisan budgetary expenditure can be doubled, they argue that with the given population of India, rupees 144 or 500 rupees per household can be transferred per month under the UBI, or what we call as modified UBI concept. Now, the question is rupees 144 enough? And the answer to the question is no, obviously. Even Tendulkar committee says that it has to be 1,500 per month and 1,800 in urban, 1,500 in rural, 1,600 average. This is not even close to it. But what the author argues is that if PM Kisan's budgetary expenditure is not very substantial, and vis-a-vis we having schemes which are targeted to other groups also, if we double, we can come to rupees 144. If we can triple or go 4 times, it may increase this amount. But what the author argues, and that is why I said that this solution is something which has no feasibility or desirability, ironically, which is that it doesn't have desirability also because it makes no sense. The argument is that can we experiment with this at least? Because the amount is too insignificant for taxpayers, and maybe it is significant enough to keep people out of poverty. Because in India, over rupees 10, people can fight and kill each other. So maybe 140 rupees a month can be experimented with. They themselves argue that this amount is very low, but on experimental basis, universal. And this 144 is not specific to any group. All of us, you, me, everybody will get rupees 144 automatically into their account on a periodic basis per month from the government. So it can prove the theory that universal basic income concept can work in India. We have the infrastructural mechanism for that. Now, then because it is quite embarrassing to say that rupees 144 per month is good enough for a social security scheme, the author himself gives a solution. He says that maybe it is not that we just go with UBI. A modified UBI plus Manrega or midday meal or other schemes may be good enough to create a safety net for Indians to not go below the poverty line. So the argument is it has to be holistic and it can be taken into consideration. So now what basically I can argue is that this article has two parts. One, it gives you the concept. The other one, it gives you a workable model, but it's purely a theoretical concept. It's a theoretical argument that yes, we can work with this and we can prove that UBI can work. Now, before we go to the question, I want to now bring all the four components together so that on this slide you understand everything what this article is trying to argue. Why am I doing this with you? Because modified UBI and UBI will always remain relevant for UPSC GS paper 3 because universal basic income will always come into context whenever there will be a crisis talked about. Now, first component was what is UBI? I hope now this is totally sorted. UBI is universal vis-a-vis not having income criteria, unconditional vis-a-vis irrespective of your employment criteria, universal, unconditional, periodic. Periodic means it has to be in a certain frequency and it has to be to the individual. So cash transfer, which is periodic, universal, unconditional and in a way to the individual. So UBI, 4 criteria makes it UBI. Now, are countries experimenting with it? Yes. Has India experimented with it? It has talked about the potentiality of it. However, there are 2 to 3 different schools which argue that DBT is already UBI. The argument of the article is very clear. No, it isn't. DBT is targeted, so it is not UBI. Now, why have we gone for DBT and not UBI? Because the desirability of UBI is there, but the feasibility of UBI is very difficult. The desirability of maybe DBT is lower, but the feasibility is possible. However, is it cheaper to go for UBI? In a way, yes. Theoretically, yes. Because DBT has a cost of administration, cost of exclusion, cost of inclusion. There's a cost linked to having a targeted scheme. UBI negates that. It removes the issue of what we call today as inclusion or exclusion error. Now, one thing which the article does not take into consideration is that in India, even when we talk about Aadhaar, even when we talk about citizenship, even when we talk about even basic identity proof, not everybody has it. And therefore, how does this make sense with such a big population where not everybody has an Aadhaar, maybe 5%, 2%, 3%, exclusion error will always be there. And there will always be an issue, but the idea is because it is universal, it will automatically become obvious. Not everybody has a bank account also. So if it has to be given in the form of cash, the cash points will be there. There will be a logistical nightmare with regards to that. There will be the cost of cash points. There will be the cost of transfer. Everything will be there. And therefore, UBI is also not free. This is where I am adding points to argue that the argument is also problematic because UBI is not cost, it's not zero cost. It is cost effective, but it is not zero cost. There is a cost for that, and maybe this balances it out. For you as an administrator, for you as an UPSC aspirant, use this concept of desirability and feasibility for anything from ethics to any other governance aspect, that there's always a desirability of something, but the feasibility of something is equally important. Therefore, now that we understand what is DBT, what is UBI, and DBT is not UBI, and what is UBI in that regard, now the question is, can we use UBI in India, or can UBI work in India? For that, they give a new solution, which is the argument that we can move for a modified concept of UBI, which is universal limited income transfer or universal limited basic income, in which they have developed a model in which 144 rupees can be transferred to each Indian if PM Kisan's budget, PM Kisan scheme's budget is doubled, and then thereafter taking everything into consideration, this can be transferred. 500 rupees per household can be transferred. Is it enough? Obviously no. But does it prove the potentiality of UBI? Can it be tested? Sure. Should it be tested? Why not? Will it impact the treasury too much? Under this model it won't. But will it really impact the social security schemes, and will it impact anything really in India at the cost or at the number they are? No. Which is again a presumption which we go by, because for you and me maybe rupees 144 may be nothing. But for a person who is just barely above the poverty line, maybe rupees 144 may be the difference. Still, it is still quite low. Still quite low. It is 1/10 of what the Tendulkar committee has argued per month to the household. But they have picked up the 6,000 rupees concept per year concept. That is basically they come to 500 rupees per month, and therefore 6,000 rupees a year. Because PM Kisan is not the only scheme under which the Kisan is or the farmer is, the Kisan has additional income. Therefore, that number itself is arbitrary, but the idea is we can use it. So, now, how will UPSC ask you a question? A lot of big things we've talked about. How will UPSC ask a question? In the context of global headwinds and automation, we need to reconsider UBI as a social security net comment. Now, here you can talk about that there is a model which has been developed by economists, wherein without significant dent to the budgetary expenditure and to the GDP, there can be, but now the word which you are going to use is limited universal income transfer. And you will say that there is desirability for the UBI, but the feasibility is only under this model. And you can argue that if you can use this example of PM Kisan scheme, if the budgetary outlay is doubled, rupees 144 can be transferred, the feasibility can be checked. It will at least test our infrastructure for something like this in the later stage. We should not outrightly reject it, but at least we should give it a chance. And DBT, if we can reduce the number of schemes under DBT, it may allow for higher budgetary allocation, therefore this money can go up. Or the argument that why would wealthy people get this income? It is zero cost, because as soon as the people will get this income, they will pay more taxes on it rather than actually gaining something out of it. So universal basic income will actually help the poor. That much has been proven. So this topic was complex. The article itself is a little bit of a utopian type of article. It gives you a vision which can be there, because he himself has developed this model, he is arguing for it, but it at least gives us an example, and it gives us this concept of feasibility and desirability which you can use for the examination. With this, let's move to the second topic, which is the end game. It says the end game, it's basically related to a district judge's order, or you can say judgment in the US against Google. Now, we obviously know how powerful Google is. We all use it. We have or are, as of right now, using an Android phone. You obviously know that you can't delete the Google apps. You can't delete Gmail. You can't delete Google Maps. Further, there's only one Play Store which is going to work, which is the Google Play Store. We also know that Google monopolizes the search engine market. Even Apple pays money to Google. that ways to be, or rather Google pays Apple money to use Google as its main search engine. And Google, that was ABC Corp, is extremely powerful. It's one of those MNCs which is part of the larger concept of what we call as neo-imperialism, that they can go to a country and change the landscape and they can dictate the legislature or the laws there in that regard. Google is monopolistic. But there has been a lot of controversy. First, it started with Apple, but then it went into Google also because of a company called Epic Games. Now, if you are in Google or Apple store, Apple will keep aside right now, that's a separate judgment. If you go into Google store, if you ever purchased an app, for example, if you go and download the Epic Games app and you want to purchase a character, for example, you will realize one thing, that if I want to purchase that, it will redirect me back to Google's Play Store. And now it will become a subscription within the Google or Google Play Store or in my App Store itself. And therefore, the money is not reaching directly to Epic. So between me and Epic Games, there is Google who is the intermediary. And Epic Games, what it did was, and the amount is quite big, it is a 30 to 40% commission which Google takes. So if I have transferred 100 rupees to the app developer, he will only get 70 to 60 rupees. He will not get the whole amount, or she will not get the whole amount. This is called Google tax. It's a monopolistic market. An Android phone, you cannot have any other marketplace. You cannot have any other app store, and therefore you are bound. I cannot use any other app store. Epic Games cannot sell on any other app store because I am not there, and therefore everybody has to come to Google. And therefore, Google tax is basically mandatory. What Epic Games did was, they basically found a, you can say, midpoint, wherein once you wanted to give them 100 rupees, it used to redirect you to a website which was Epic Games, and you could directly transfer money to Epic Games. Now, this is something which obviously Google and even Apple would not allow, because this takes away revenue from them. And this became a lawsuit in the US District Court over Epic Games subverting the Google process and therefore taking money away from Google. Google acted like a victim, that they lost 30 to 40% of their commission in this, and therefore Epic Games is cheating. However, this lawsuit has now basically backfired on Google, because the district judge has argued that this Google tax is monopolistic against capitalistic principles of free market, and therefore the judgment has argued that Google will now have to allow on Android phones, because it is also a Google platform, on Android phones to not have Google apps pre-installed first. Second, to not have this concept of everything redirecting to Google itself. They will need to have an alternative payment scheme, and further they will have to allow people to download and use other app stores also. And if this judgment goes through properly, until it is, obviously Google will appeal, if it is reinforced, this may show, or it's basically the starting of the end of the monopolistic behavior of Google. This is where this may be a very big concept. From 15 to 30, in Apple's case, from 18 to 40%, average 30 to 40%, the commission which the company has been charging on the Play Store has been questioned. And even Google cuts special deals where it lowers its commission if you want to go into a certain scheme, exclusive scheme with Google. And for app developers, this has been the most problematic aspect, because it restricts what we call as alternative payment options, and therefore disproportionate power with Google. Now, the recent injunction in the US District Judge James Donato has argued that they would need to now change this. The Epic Games saga, which started with Apple and then went with Google, is the reason why they are struggling with this battle in court. And this is basically the judgment. I'll read out the judgment with its basic concepts. He has said that Google has to halt the practice of having limited competition, which is paying companies to launch exclusively in their marketplace, or pre-installing Google Play on the new devices. Further, it has mandated that rival app stores should be available on Android phones and they should be available on the Play Store itself. Further, alternative payment methods should also be there. For 3 years, this has been a very big issue for Google in America. This may be the beginning of the end of Android ecosystem being dominated by Google. However, obviously Google is going to appeal, and the way the lobbying works in America, this may be overturned. But this gives us an understanding of 3 things for UPSC. One, that monopolies still exist. Apple, Google, Microsoft, all of these companies have monopolistic behavior. They tend to control the market. Google controls everything in the ad space, everything in the search engine optimization space. They control more or less everything in the App Store. Android itself is therefore a whole concept which is based on Google, and you cannot remove Google out of it. Further, Google controls even now payment schemes, and because app developers cannot get the income which they deserve, and there is a commission for that which is called Google tax, therefore monopolistic behavior exists. Apple is also following the same in the App Store which they have. The second aspect is, should this be challenged? Yes, because free market, if we live in a capitalistic model, has to be with equal opportunity to all buyers and sellers. If everybody is going to be a loser and only Google is going to be the winner, it is not a free market. And in America, and already EU has started to move, EU made Apple change its lightning port into a Type-C, and now Google has already, there has been multiple injunctions in India also. In the EU has already fined Google for its monopolistic behavior with $600 billion of, you can say, fines in that sense. But the idea is Google is still not allowing it to be a part of it. They're fighting it. But for you, this is the question. Google's monopolistic behavior needs to be checked, and regulations in this regard are crucial. Do you agree? This is not just about Google. This is also about neo-imperialism, which is the concept of domination of countries via institutions, specifically MNCs. And therefore, Google's monopolistic behavior has to be checked, needs to be checked and regulated. So, interesting topic, simple, straightforward topic that way. Thereafter, we move into another article which has a lot to give us. But when it came to giving a solution, he gave only one small paragraph. India needs to address their development and increase inequality and equality, this and that. So basically, all of this is just data. When it came to giving us a solution, it didn't. So again, there are 2-3 types of articles which come in the newspaper: problem solving, identifying issues, and one which only gives you the basic picture. This is a basic picture article. It gives you the picture of what we call today as HDI, which is Human Development Index or indicators. And it is based on the latest report of the Human Development Report, HDR as it is called. The HDR report has recently been published. Now, why are we having this discussion? Because these things may be sprinkled around, or you can sprinkle it across your answers. It does identify 2 key areas in which, or 3 key areas in which India has to improve quite significantly. Now, first things first, HDI or Human Development Index of the UNDP, what are the 3 considerations it takes in? I will not have a discussion of India vis-a-vis Bangladesh, China, Bhutan, this and that, because that comparison in HDI makes no sense whatsoever. India comparing itself with China over HDI and China performing better is a joke, because China itself is not a democratic state. It is a one-party system where Xi Jinping has dictatorial power. It's a surveillance state. So therefore, even if my human development indicators would be lower than China, that is better because at least our democracy is healthy and vibrant. Therefore, India and Nepal or India and Bangladesh again makes no sense. Look at the population, look at the geography, look at the irritants, look at the larger global picture. Makes no sense whatsoever to have these comparisons. So we will take all of these indicators for India in a more holistic and straightforward one-dimensional way, no comparison. So there's no point criticizing India for being lower than Sri Lanka. There's no point, because Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan don't have the same pressures and issues which we have. With the population and with the global stage we have, let's at least discount this, that the indicators are problematic, not the comparison. So, HDI under UNDP takes three things into consideration. First is life expectancy at birth, which is long and healthy life, human development. Second, it takes two indicators related to schools or schooling. Expected years of schooling, this includes repetition if you are repeating the school years itself, and mean years of schooling, meaning what is the expected years. The expectation in India would be 15 years of schooling, but what is the mean years of schooling, meaning are students remaining in the school for 15 years or not. So there can be a mismatch, that expected years is 15, however they are only 9 years in school, which is a problem. And then for decent life, it takes a very standard indicator, which is income per capita. Now, per capita income itself is a very flawed concept, because every country has a different level of development and the population changes the per capita income. And therefore, more or less, people have stopped talking about HDI for the same reason, because it does not give you a very close indicator or very accurate indication of income and prosperity in the world. That is why happiness index has come through. That again is problematic. But the idea is decent standard of living. If income by per capita will go, then India will automatically go down, because we have a very big population with a 4 trillion economy. Now, these three are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals 3, 4, 5, 8 and 10, which is good health, good education, gender equality, decent work and reduce inequality. So therefore, we work in a model in which we use these concepts to create a certain indicator. Now, what has been the performance of India in HDI? When we talk about the performance of India in HDI, we have stagnated to the value of 0.644. So, in 2019-2020, we were at 0.638. Then it fell to 0.633, and now it has improved to 0.644 in 2022. Now, in this report, the HDR report 2023-2024, the value is again in the same range of 0.644. So therefore, if there's any statement in the examination which says that we have dramatically improved our human development category from medium to something, or we have seen a steady growth or steady improvement in our human development in the past decade or so, the answer to that question or that statement is wrong, because we have stagnated. We have reached to a certain number 0.644 and 6633. We have now stagnated to that number. So do understand, any question with HDI and talks about steady, exponential or growth vis-a-vis in the past decade or so for the number or the indicator is incorrect. And that is because the per capita income aspect has not dramatically increased, and because of COVID and because of the shock which COVID sent into the healthcare sector and into the education sector, there will obviously be no dramatic change. So that is quite natural. But what is more interesting for you and me is the Gender Development Index or the GDI, which is actually given within the HDR report. Human Development Report also has GDI, which is Gender Development Index by the UNDP for 193 countries. This is where the real problem starts vis-a-vis gender. Now, when we talk about gender, there is an issue, and the issue is that we have two anomalies. The report tells you for men and women how development has impacted them, but it also talks about gaps between women and men. Now here a specific indicator is used, which is called labor force participation rate. Labor force participation rate formula is the number of people employed plus unemployed divided by the total working population. So working population is defined as 15 years and above, and this is basically called labor force. So labor force participation rate is basically the number of people who are employed and unemployed in the marketplace, in the workspace, divided by the total working population. Now here it turns out that if you look at it in a gendered way, men labor force participation rate is 76.1%, meaning out of the working population which is of men, 76% of them are part of the workforce. On the other hand, only 28.3% of the women are part of the workforce vis-a-vis the concept of the workforce participation rate. This is a close to 48% difference in men and women in work. So women, only 30%, close to 30% of the women are actually working, though they are eligible to work, and 76% of men are working, and that is where there is a major gendered gap, and this gap is quite high, which is much lower. This 28% is much lower than 53, 39 in even Bangladesh, China, and in Bhutan. But again, this comparison makes no sense. But what is even more problematic is, if I go into the number related to female labor force work participation in rural and in urban, now comes the anomaly. And the anomaly is that women in rural India are working more, but women in urban area are not working more, which is 41.5% in 2022-23 women in 41% of women in rural India are working, but only 25% of women in urban area are working. This is where the anomaly is, and a lot of research needs to happen. This is related to the feminization of agriculture and the aspect of what you call single circular migration into the industries of the male. But why is there stagnation in the urban sector? And why is that women are becoming more and more part of the rural sector, but in disguised unemployment? Therefore, gendered aspects of development are problematic. Further, when we talk about the income inequality in India, 1% of the population in India controls 21% of the wealth in India, which itself is again problematic. Looking at the global average and the South Asian average of 17.5 and 19.6%, most of the wealth is concentrated in few hands in India, and therefore redistribution of wealth is important. Now, all of this data is in a way irrelevant for you until unless you don't understand what to do with it. The first concept, where I'm again trying to bring in the concept, is that when we talk about HDI, HDI has stagnated, HDI has not improved too much. So if there's any statement with regards to HDI, there is a certain plateauing of the percentage points. When we talk about labor force participation rate, when we talk about that, labor force participation rate concept is women only 30% are part of the workforce of the eligible population of women, and 76% of men. There's a major gap between how many or how men are getting integrated into the workforce and women are. But in labor force participation rate, what is even more interesting is rural women are working, 41% of them. On the other hand, only 25% of urban women are working. And therefore, this is where the real anomaly lies. Last but not the least, income inequality is problematic because 1% controls 21% of wealth. So therefore, when it came to giving solutions, the article stopped and it said that India needs to take these things into consideration. Now, why are we having this discussion? Because you can use all of this data for the examination, which is human development stagnation. With regards to gender, be it essay, be it anything else, you can use it. And thereafter, inequality, you can again talk about how there is need for redistribution of wealth, socialistic principle of the constitution. So you can get a question like this: India's human development indicators are stagnating and need to be prioritized. Do you agree? So you can write an answer for this where you have to talk about the indicators and how they're getting stagnated and prioritization of the gendered and the inequality space, inequality space. So this article again gives you a lot. Today's paper gives you a lot to write in the examination, a lot to think about it for the examination. So therefore, try to use it for the examination in that regard. Okay. Now moving on to the next article. The next article also gives you a lot to think about what is called as the healthcare sector. Now here we all in a way got shocked by, disgusted by what happened in the R.G. Kar Medical College. We await justice for the victim. We await answerability, accountability, and in a way we need to find a solution for this very heinous behavior and a psychological issue which men face in India today that ways. However, after that, there have been multiple waves of doctors' protests across India, in West Bengal. But what this article actually talks about is, it tries to point out the issues which the healthcare sector faces and how they are leading to India to become more poorer and people being pushed into the, what we can say, below the poverty line in that regard. Now, the argument which is therefore given is that if we look at the numbers which are quoted by even the NSO and even the doctors fraternity, 75% of doctors in India are working in hospitals which do not have infrastructure. They have 36-hour shifts with no proper resting rooms. Further, they are working in hospitals which do not have the right infrastructure. They are being abused, and the number of incidents where doctors have been abused physically and verbally have increased further again exponentially. And therefore, there is a need to reconsider the healthcare sector in India and its basic landscape. Now, what the article points out is that the expenditure of the GDP on healthcare is only 2%. 2% expenditure is quite low vis-a-vis countries such as China, where 5 to 10% is the global average. With 2% infrastructure, with 2% expenditure on healthcare in that regard, what is the basic result is low quality healthcare. And what the article points out, written by a doctor himself, is that low quality healthcare means that public hospitals are in a state of alarm and bother, while private hospitals have been thriving. And the number is quite astonishing. For the private hospitals, 8% share in healthcare at the time of we becoming a republic, to now 70% of all healthcare being now managed by the private sector. But what is even more astonishing is the fact that there is a 7 times difference between public and private, you can say, bills, which is, if I go to a public hospital and if I spend 100 rupees, in a private hospital I have to spend 700 rupees. 7 times difference is there vis-a-vis the amount of money which has to go from the patient to the hospital. And therefore, this is where the problem is. We have not created the right hospitals for public, so therefore people prefer to go to private. Private therefore has become 70% of all healthcare expenditure, and with 7 times difference, the problem is the insurance cover in India is very low. And therefore, with only 14% insurance cover in rural India and 19% insurance cover in urban India, most of the expenditure here is out of pocket, meaning it is out of pocket expenditure, and therefore whatever the difference is, this 600 rupees is being paid by the patient. And the next interesting number is this expenditure 7 times more. People are using 52% of their savings to give medical bills. and there is a astonishing number, which is that 7% of Indians went below the poverty line, went below basic incomes in India because of the expenditure which they made in the medical sector. And this is where this article becomes very interesting. It gives you a very bleak scenario of how healthcare works in India. There are three basic conclusions which I can draw and I will tell you. First is that there is not a lot of expenditure on the public sector hospitals. So therefore, governmental expenditure is 2%, which is extremely very, very low vis-a-vis the global averages. Second, the article talks about corruption, and the Transparency International report tells us that in the medical sector, pharma, doctor and the governmental corruption rate has increased exponentially, and that in turn has led to leakages. Therefore, public hospitals are not invested upon, but private hospitals are, and therefore private hospitals' share in healthcare has gone to 70%. Because of this, people are spending more in private sector. Private sector, the differentiating factor is close to 7 times. They spend 7 times more in the private hospital. That is also 52% of the savings, meaning people pay most of those bills out of their savings, and therefore with no insurance for most of Indians, they are pushed into poverty, and this creates a vicious circle of death, disease, poverty, and more or less there is a lot of problem. One second. Right? VMix I want. Okay, so as I said that there is a vicious circle in which all Indians are now stuck. Just to repeat, 2% of GDP expenditure, 8% of share was there in 1950, which has now become 70% of all healthcare. Further, private and public differentiation is quite big. 52% of the savings of the people goes into this. Further, there is insurance coverage which is quite low. I have been told by the team that maybe the screen was not captured. I will show you this slide and you will get the PDF in my Telegram channel, so don't worry. I will repeat the data of all these 3 articles, don't worry about that. Just to show you this data, 2%, 8%, 70% between 1950 and today. Private and public 7 times difference. Thereafter 100 to 700, 7 times difference. 7% of people go below poverty line because of this expenditure, which is 7 times more. And in the previous article, I had talked about HDI, which is the concept of stagnating at 0.4644%. Thereafter, we have talked about the gender development index. In that, labor force participation rate, which is employed and unemployed, labor force divided by working population, more than 15 years of age. This is where the anomaly came, 28% and 76%. Further, the idea was that India is one of the countries where there is a lot of income inequality, 1% controlling 21% of the wealth. I think this is where the screen capture had stopped. Now, before I move on to the next topic, this is a question which can come in the examination. The healthcare sector in India needs a complete overhaul and rethink. Comment. This is a very interesting question which can come in the examination. Now, before I go to tomatoes, there are now last 2 topics. Don't worry, in the end, I will try to give you a summary of all these articles. So, if you have not been able to follow because of nothing on the screen, don't worry about that. Okay. So, it's that time of the year where, as we say it, that there will be fire in the market with regards to the prices of tomatoes. Tomato mein aag lag jayega. That ways, tomato prices have started to soar. And this article actually talks about food inflation. But this is something which I discussed in class with regards to the Great Depression. It explains why tomato prices have actually started to increase. So, This is something where we can see something impact. Now, this is basically a supply chain issue, which is demand remains more or less constant or increases at this point of time. But this is pure supply chain, wherein the first reason why tomato prices have started to go up is because the sowing this year, there was a major gap. There was a major gap in the sowing of tomato crop itself. There's a decline in the hectareage of what we call as tomato from you have 2.66 to 2.44, which is a difference of 0.22 lakh hectares less than what we had last year. So there first is, this is where supply reduces. And the second aspect is going to be that now that there was less sowing, thereafter there has been less supply. You can see very less supply of tomatoes into the mandis. And if you look at the prices, they have been hovering around that 20-25 rupees mark, has reached 45, because this had a cascading effect. First is the sowing decline, second is the arrival decline. And the other factor which has been added by the article is that if we go by the, you can say, rainfall data of the states which supply tomatoes, the tomato belts, which is Rayalaseema, Karnataka, Western MP, Odisha, Gujarat, and the Madhya Maharashtra sector, there has been a surplus of rainfall. And this means that this has led to the destruction of the tomato crop. And therefore, the supply further falls down. And that is why you can see that the north is facing a much bigger crisis with 70 rupees per kg vis-a-vis south, which has 56 rupees or 58 rupees. This is where the supply chain bottlenecks are creating issues. This article basically gives you evidence of why there has been a inflationary trend and 233% jump in the prices of retail tomatoes between July and June and July, and then August 23%. And this is where this may impact food inflation numbers and vegetable inflation numbers. And now, again, as always, top tomatoes, onion and potatoes. Now it is a turn of tomatoes to go beyond the certain number. And this is the season where actually tomatoes are going to become more than what it should be in the larger context. Now, this is just a demonstrating article, an interesting one, which basically gives you a little bit of more insight in that regard. But the last article is just about an update. 1 second. Right. So the last article gives you an update about the Israel and Palestine issue, which is that the mastermind of the 7th October Israel attack by Hamas is now dead, Sinwar. Though Hamas has not confirmed it, Sinwar is believed to be, and Sinwar is now believed to be dead, is the architect of the attack. And this is a further escalation point in the larger story of what we today call as the Israel-Palestine issue, the Hamas-Israel issue in that regard. And this may escalate things further. So therefore, with the death of multiple important personalities related to Hezbollah and Hamas, this is where Israel is trying to take revenge for what happened 1 year on vis-a-vis the 7th October attack. Now, before I end this session, what I want to do is I want to summarize the basic aspects of what we've done today. Because it was quite, you can say, data driven and data heavy, let's try to understand what are the basic conclusions. The first article, what we discussed was the concept of UBI. Just to give you a basic understanding, UBI, universal, unconditional, periodic, and the concept of has to be given to an individual. Is DBT UBI? No, it isn't, because it is targeted. Is it desirable? Yes. But is it feasible? No. There's a model in which limited universal basic income can be given, and there is a model for that by increasing the budgetary outlay for PM Kisan and then rupees 144 being transferred. The second article was about Google tax, wherein the concept of how Google is creating a monopolistic behavior on the Android platform and on the marketplaces, and therefore it needs to be curbed, and the first blow to it has been given. The third article is more important, where human development indicators have stagnated. Labor force participation rate points out two gendered problematic aspects of Indian, you can say, gender workspace, or you can say labor landscape. Women are only 30% of the women in the working population of women are actually employed, and the difference between men and women is close to 46%, which is 30% of women, 76% of men. But the more interesting aspect is rural women are working more, urban women are working less. That is even more problematic. Further, 1% of Indians control 21% of the income, and therefore income inequality is also a problem. The fourth article talks about tomatoes. Tomatoes, why there has been a increase in prices, which will impact inflation numbers, and therefore the RBI would have to do something about that. That is because sowing was lower, arrival has been delayed, rainfall too much, and last but not the least, this in turn creates a cascading effect where there's a supply chain bottleneck. The fifth article talks about the concept of healthcare sector in India, wherein 2% of the GDP is pushed into healthcare, 70% of the healthcare landscape is controlled by private sector. In private, you have to spend 7 times more. Therefore, 52% of the savings of the people is pushed into the healthcare, and therefore they go under below poverty line because of the expenditure which they do. There needs to be a higher budgetary outlay, and corruption in the healthcare sector needs to be managed and talked about. And the sixth article is about this person, the top Hamas leader, Sinwar, being killed in Gaza by the Israeli military, a major breakthrough for Israel in the larger context. So with this, I would like to end the session. I hope all these economics-based articles, a lot of data, I hope that I've given you that understanding how to use it in the examination and I've made sense for that. Thank you, take care, and bye-bye.